All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Mastering the Art of Rider Surveys. My name is Kaj Huddart from Transit's partnerships team. I am joined today by two colleagues, data scientist Marisa Henry from Transit's analytics team, as well as Transit's Chief Business Officer, David Block-Schachter. Today's webinar is not just about us talking at you, but hopefully also having a conversation. I'm sure you'll have questions over the next 30 minutes, so please click the Q&A button below to enter them, and we'll answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. Today's also special because we are both updating you on stats from our Rider Happiness Benchmarking program and showing you Rate My Ride, a completely new form of customer survey. It's going to change how agencies both collect and act on rider feedback. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, though, it's important to understand why surveys are more necessary than ever right now. And I think that's pretty simple. Ridership recovery from the pandemic has stalled out. So if agencies want to attract riders, they need to know what brings them on board and what keeps them coming back. And a good way to do that, we think, is by asking them. So here on this slide, you can see the latest stats from the US Ridership Trends dashboard that we launched with APTA. It gives weekly estimates of transit ridership as a hard number and also as a percentage compared to weekly ridership numbers from the year before the pandemic. So as of last week, that number of 102 million rides in the United States was equal to 54% of weekly ridership in 2019. At about this time last year, we were at 50%, meaning that over the past year, an additional 4% of pre-pandemic riders have returned. So that's why we say recovery has stalled. But enough depressing statistics. Let's dive into surveying itself. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Guy. So thanks for that context. It's a challenging time. Public transit's a fantastic thing in and of itself. It's something I've spent my career trying to contribute to in some small way, including my time at the MBTA in Boston as their CTO. But it's also how we end up with more livable, equitable, green cities. It's one of the ways that we as a society can ensure equal access to opportunities for everyone. So when fewer people ride public transit, it's not just an impact on the system, it's an impact on the values that we care about as a society. One of the reasons I joined transit is because of the reach it has to improve riders' lives. The obvious way that we do this is by focusing on the user experience, better real-time information, other features that create more legibility, transparency of transit systems, both large and small. We're good at it. It has real impact. But ultimately, transit agencies are the ones who are best placed to improve riders' journeys. To do this, they need to understand their riders better. Transit agencies need to design initiatives to suit who's riding now, who will come back to riding transit in this changed world that we live in, and who might try it for the first time. They need to measure all of the amazing things that they're doing. And to do this, they need tools that allow them to get continuous feedback from their riders and to learn from what other agencies are doing. It's hard working at a transit agency right now. Ridership is down, but more importantly, it's different. How it's different varies from city to city, from route to route, from neighborhood to neighborhood. So as I dive into this, submit your questions using the Q&A button. We'll address them at the end or follow up with you if we can't get to all of them. Okay, so what are the typical tools that you use to understand riders? I want to be clear, these different methods are all good, should all be part of your toolkit, but it's important to recognize their limitations and blind spots as well. First up, intercept surveys. I paid for them. I've even been out in the field administering them. They're great. But they cost a lot of money. They take time and they don't end up with huge sample sizes. You've got benchmarking surveys, asking the same questions across agencies so agencies can learn from their peers. They require coordination between agencies. There's a few out there. They're fantastic for the folks who participate when they run, but they still require people to go out into the field. So it's just as expensive. And you can only benchmark against the peers that can fund at the same time in order to participate. Then you've got customer panels, longitudinal surveys, whatever you want to call them. They get a whole bunch of users. They ask them the same questions again and again, every month, every quarter. And it helps you really track your initiatives and KPIs over time. But they take a lot of effort to set up, lots of love and care and feeding to keep people responding. And because those lists tend to be collected by email, it's really hard to keep them representative. As we've worked with our partners at agencies, what we hear again and again is that they end up too white, too rich, too suburban, with too small a sample size to look at the impacts at the root level, and that ends up decreasing their value. So what we're talking about today is adding a fourth and fifth way to the mix. They take advantage of the millions of users who already use our app to get around every day. The first is Rate My Ride, which allows users to give instant feedback. And the second is the Ridership Happiness Benchmarking survey, which is a quarterly survey that helps agencies compare themselves over time and to peers. Before we go into the details, let me just say there's no platonic form of survey. The tools we're adding are just tools, not magic bullets. They have pluses that address gaps in existing survey methods, but they don't replace some of the positives of traditional surveys. As we've worked with agencies large and small across the US and Canada on these new ways of surveying riders using these digital tools that are already in their hands, we've heard all the roadblocks. Both for these new ways of surveying, but also just from surveying riders generally. In a bad economic climate, any money being spent is being closely watched, and it requires justification, and especially any dollars not spent directly on operations. So these stumbling blocks to surveying riders vary, but they basically come down to two. The first is it's too expensive to get as much feedback from customers as I think we need. And the second, my CEO, my GM doesn't think the results are legit. So on money, by not having a ton of people in the field, but doing it on device, we reduce the cost tremendously. But that leads to the second, which is people who use smartphones are richer, younger, whiter. That's the common perception. They aren't representative of the people who use our buses and trains. We've got some great data on that, and my colleague Kaj will also go into even more depth later on. Okay. The quick word on the representativeness of the people who take our surveys before I spend some time on the tools themselves and then turn it over to Marisa to share some actual results. We've looked at demographics versus general population, the gray bar in the chart, and versus transit commuters, which is the light blue on the chart. And what we found is that, if anything, users in transit overrepresent communities of color in our app. Looking at income, it's the same thing. More than 60% of our users, and this is non-student users, are in households that earn less than $50,000 a year. Putting it simply, our app users look like most bus drivers because that's where our app helps the most. Okay, onto the tools. First up is Rate My Ride, which is our digital intercept survey. At the beginning of the pandemic, like all of you, we at Transit were trying to figure out what we could do to help riders. So we turned to our Go feature, which is a helpful companion to your trip. It tells you when to leave, your stop's coming up, when to get off, in your ear, so you can focus on the things that you like to do while riding transit. For me, that's napping. As part of this feature, riders opt into sharing their location during the trip. And we use that along with some fancy data science to understand when they're walking to their stop, when they're waiting, when they're on the bus, and when they're transferring, and when they get off to get to their destination. So we figured we could use this. We could ask people if their bus was crowded, right, when they got on the bus. We could share that data with other riders waiting for the bus. We could create models to predict when the bus would be crowded for the times that we don't have this crowdsourced data live. So what we found here surprised even us. More than 50% of riders responded when we asked. And that made us think, what other questions could we ask them? Okay. Long story short, in April of this year, we launched Rate My Ride with 5 questions. The first at the stop is whether that stop is accessible. We only ask people once per stop, so if they commute by the same route every day, they don't get tired of us asking the same question. The second is something that we're actually just about to introduce. We're excited to see what it does. It's so new, we don't even have a screenshot on the slide for it. But it's if we detect that somebody's waiting for a bus, but they don't actually get on the bus that passes them according to the bus location or scheduled data, we want to know what actually happened. Was the real-time data wrong and there was no bus, which is a so-called ghost bus? Or did the bus pass them by? Did it never come? Or something else entirely? There's no data on this anywhere, and we're excited to, for the first time, actually start collecting some. So the next 3 questions happen when the rider's on the vehicle. We've got crowding, whether users are wearing masks, and whether they perceive that the vehicle came on time based on the predictions in the app. And then when they get off the vehicle, we ask them to rate their trip from 1 to 5 stars. The questions are simple. They take seconds to answer. They're relevant to the rider. The rider doesn't have to tell us what bus they're on or route or where they're going. No huge contact form to fill out. We just know. Importantly, we share that information back with riders, so they know that they're contributing to a community. And we can't expect people to want to answer questions if they think their responses are just going into the void. So this first screenshot's from the route detail screen. It shows that the route has an average rating of 3.5 stars. 86% of people thought the vehicle arrived when predicted, and most people wear masks. And if you tap on any of those, you get into the details. We also share with the public. We created this little tool at the address in the chat where you can go and see the proportion of riders and agencies across the US and Canada that have worn masks every day since the beginning of April, as well as how that varies by time of day. You can see the gradual decline across the US and Canada following the repeal of the federal mask mandate, as well as a quick drop-off in Montreal, which is in orange on this chart, following the repeal of the mandate just this last Saturday. There's no other data on this publicly available from any source. So this gives transit agencies a sense of what to expect and what their peers are doing and experiencing. So now we get onto the thing that I'm by far the most excited about. We're just starting to let agencies ask their own questions. These are attached to a specific journey. It's an origin, a destination, a stop, a route, and a vehicle. They can be focused across routes or on a specific route or time of day. And you get lots of results. Based on the questions that we're asking right now, we have more than 100,000 responses every single day across the US and Canada. And what this means is that you've got relevant data, not just one time, but you get this constant feedback on the questions you want to ask, when you want to ask them. I'm really excited to see what agencies do with this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marisa to share some of the data we found. But before I do, let me just remind you to submit your questions using the Q&A button.
Thanks, David. So for these examples we're going to walk through, we'll focus on bus lines in New York City. Just a reminder, these are the same questions in New York that we're asking of riders in your city. We're just using New York as an example. So first we'll look at some of the results to the question, did the bus come when you expected it? We can use responses to this question to evaluate on an agency level, which routes tend to run the most late or the most early. So for example, 16% of responses for the B6 bus in Brooklyn indicate that the bus was running later than expected. We can also look at what times of day specific routes tend to be most late or early. So back to the B6 bus, we can look at the percent of responses which were later than expected by hour and see that the bus tends to run the most late in the morning commute hours and then later in the evening, but it runs less late than the average Brooklyn route during the evening commute hours. Next, we'll take a look at stop accessibility. Making stops accessible is vital to advancing transit equity. In our latest Rider Happiness Benchmarking survey, nearly 23% of respondents who answered demographic questions indicated that they had difficulty walking or climbing stairs. But many agencies don't have complete knowledge of the accessibility of their stops. 39% of North American agencies in transit don't have any stop accessibility information in their GTFS, and the rest often have incomplete data. Running a full audit of stop accessibility can be time-consuming and costly, but by using Rate My Ride responses, agencies can crowdsource from actual riders which of their stops are least accessible and use this information to prioritize which stops need accessibility improvements. In this map, we're showing the percent of Rate My Ride responses, which indicated the stop was usually accessible. So the blue points indicate stops with relatively high confidence the stop is accessible, while those that are in red indicate users felt the stop was either not accessible or they weren't sure if the stop was accessible. And finally, I'll touch a little bit on mask compliance. So many agencies have been lifting mask requirements on public transit over the last several months. But the MTA is still requiring masks on board vehicles. But when we look at the route by route data here, we can see that the level of mask compliance varies significantly by line and borough by borough. The map here illustrates the percent of respondents who indicated most people were wearing masks during their trip. Again, the darker blue indicates where most were wearing masks, and the red colors indicate where only some or most were not wearing masks. We can see that the Bronx has the lowest rates of most people wearing masks. And interestingly, there's an east-west split in the compliance in Manhattan. In Brooklyn, you can see areas west and south of Prospect Park have higher masking rates than areas to the north and east. And in Queens, Eastern Queens has higher masking rates than the west. This data can be used by agencies to help target their current and future public health efforts on transit. And now I'm going to hand it back to Kaj, but before I do, if you have any questions about this data I've just talked about, please click the Q&A button and we'll answer them at the end.
Hey, thanks, Marisa. So Rate My Ride is something new. We just launched it in April, and as you can see, it's already generating some really interesting insights. But now I'm going to take a little bit of time to focus on the Rider Happiness Benchmarking Survey, which gives agencies a view across their peers and also over time. So in that sense, you could say it's a good thing we've been running it for a while. We've actually been running the RHB for well over a year now. So the Rider Happiness Benchmark is a quarterly recurring survey we run across North America, asking the same questions to riders of the 200 different cities that we serve with our app. Questions in the RHB are divided into 3 sections. So the first, rider satisfaction, covers how riders feel about their agency's service. We collect marketing and branding metrics like the Net Promoter Score, satisfaction with key elements of service delivery like on-time performance or safety and cleanliness. And also how folks feel about local communication of disruptions and their improvement in priorities as riders. Rider characteristics then covers how riders actually use the system. So think metrics like mode split, frequency of riding, purpose of trip, and so on. And lastly, the demographics section covers a range of key indicators like household income, gender and racial identities, age, and occupation. And with all of that, provides a great basis for cross-tabulation with the satisfaction and riding habits data. We do keep things consistent for the most part from one quarter to the next, of course, to enable that temporal comparison for our subscribing agencies, all of whom gather regularly as members of the RHB steering committee. So speaking of which, the steering committee is composed of a lively crew of agencies who care about pushing forward the customer experience with data, from BC Transit in British Columbia to PSTA in Florida, and from Trois-Rivières, Quebec to Pierce Transit in suburban Seattle. So each of these agencies has opted into the annual subscription to the RHB program. That means that they get every single survey response we collect from their riders every single quarter, as well as complete stats for every other agency in the data set, whether they are a subscriber or not. Importantly for us at Transit, the steering committee also advises us on anything we change in the question list. We collectively discuss and approve new ideas for questions. And the meetings also, of course, serve as kind of a forum for like-minded agencies to talk about how to use customer experience data to improve services. So this most recent quarter of spring 2022 saw us collect data over the last week of April and first week of May. We got well over 27,000 responses and achieved statistical significance for some 68 agencies across 23 US states and 7 provinces. We run the survey in 3 different languages, and that broke down to 24,000 English responses, 2,700 Spanish responses, and 1,100 French responses. So now let's take a look at a couple highlights from this spring's RHB program results. Also like to remind you, the North America-wide report from the RHB contains these stats. It is available to download via the URL in the chat. So I mentioned how the demographics questions offer a ton of interesting cross-tabulations to the satisfaction data. Providing new ways for agencies to measure equity in service provision is something we're really proud to do. So each quarter, we'd like to highlight a new and interesting demographic crosstab. You can see the satisfaction categories we analyzed this round. We rotate some of the questions on a 6-month basis as our steering committee advises. This quarter, we decided to look at gender identity versus feeling safe while riding. So for gender self-ID, riders can report as male, female, non-binary / non-conforming, or select prefer not to say. For almost all agencies, males reported feeling safer than any other response to the gender ID question. And then we also saw at a national level, non-binary falling generally below female for most of the agencies we looked at. Looking at sort of high variations among gender identity, we found as high as 14% of men reporting a 14% higher safety score than women for cities like New York, and Edmonton, Alberta. The last thing I want to say today about demographics from this past quarter We don't normally highlight big differences between the US and Canada, as those are often, sort of driven by national policy, culture, things that are beyond the reach of public transit agencies. But the difference in age distribution that we see on this slide is incredibly stark. So the most common age category among our Canadian users is 18 to 24. In the United States, it's 45 to 54. We've actually seen this for the whole past year of the RHB. But spring 22 is really the first quarter when all schools and colleges were both in session and also in person, basically everywhere. So with that kind of confirmation, this is why we're talking about this now. I do want to point out there's huge diversity among the couple hundred different US agencies we serve. Our national stats reflect the weight of big cities in the overall user base. That's where most transit riders are. But of course, I'd expect a different distribution for a college town like Boulder, Colorado, or Lansing, Michigan. But regardless, this is definitely a key challenge for American transit agencies and even for national policymakers, because the future of getting beyond the 54% of pre-pandemic ridership that we've plateaued at has to include effort at attracting and retaining the patronage of young riders. So every September, a new generation of first-year high school and college students is introduced to public transit for the first time. Some of them will keep riding for a long time. Many others will switch to, a first used car purchase as soon as they can. The kind of experience that these young folks have on public transit is what's going to determine if and when they make that switch, and therefore also ridership trends for the years and decades to come. So on that customer experience note, let's take a look at what the RHB can tell us about rider priorities for improving their own systems and how that can vary from one agency to another. Back to you, Marisa.
Thanks. So one of the benefits of RHB is our ability to ask more complex questions than we might have been able to ask in something like Rate My Ride. For example, the question that is always at the top of agencies' minds, how should they prioritize improvements to their service to make riders the most happy? In RHB, we ask respondents to select the top 3 things their agency could do to get them to ride more. Across all US responses, better real-time information is the #1 improvement riders are looking for. But the priorities of riders also vary pretty significantly from agency to agency. For example, agencies in Toronto had the highest % of respondents selecting fare capping as one of their highest priorities. This could be in part due to the recent news that the TTC has recommended switching to fare capping over monthly passes. So Toronto riders might be more aware of the benefits of fare capping policies. Edmonton, LA Metro, and the New York Subway all had a focus on improving safety for riders on board and while waiting at stops. If you recall earlier, Kai also mentioned that Edmonton and New York both had significant disparities in feelings of safety between men and women. So these riders, and particularly women, are feeling unsafe, and they're asking their agency to prioritize improvements in this area. And finally, riders of the STM in Montreal prioritize making it easier for riders to buy and use tickets. In the past, the Montreal area offered mobile ticketing for bus trips, but that is no longer the case. So this priority may indicate riders want mobile ticketing back. And now I'm going to pass it back to David to wrap everything up.
Okay. So apparently it's my job to wrap all this information up in a nice little bow. Let me try. Agencies have responded mightily during this pandemic. They're not entities built for quick responses, but staff have taken processes that take years and changed them in a matter of just months. The changes that I've seen over the last 3 years make me proud of our partners. They make me hopeful for a future where public transit continues to positively impact cities. What I've shown you are tools that you can add to your toolbox. Some cool results that hopefully are useful on their own, and also make you think about the ways these tools could be used to make a positive impact on your city and your region. All surveys are imperfect. They're surveys, they're not facts. As agencies respond in record time with these new initiatives, they need tools that can work on that same time scale. You need to understand how your initiatives are performing now, not how your riders are feeling now, not in 6 months. I wish I had these tools when I worked in the public sector. I'm looking forward to the creative, unexpected ways that you'll use these new things that we're introducing and all the feedback that get on how they can be even better. Speaking of feedback, let's get to the questions. Kai, have some come in?
Yes, we do. And also just a reminder, if you have a question, please continue to use that Q&A button to submit it. I'll start with ones that we have gotten already. Emma asks, can agencies access mapping visualizations when using Rate My Ride to ask questions specific to their agency? David, I think this is one for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question because honestly, we haven't thought about this yet. We just started. Our goal right now is to understand the questions that agencies want to ask, not just the questions that we put out there, whether it's safety and security, whether it's heating and cooling on board, whether it's, whatever is there and whatever the agency's interested at the time. So we need to know it's useful. Right now, our plan is to give you all of the raw data. So as it comes in, the thousands and thousands of responses, each attached to a route, an origin and destination, a stop, etc. But I can see how that could be a little overwhelming. So the idea of being able to use the maps just like we created for this presentation and that you'll see in the report and in the blog post about this, it's a great idea. And unless you've already called copyright on it, I'm going to steal it, and we're going to do it.
Awesome. Okay. Jason asks, do you all have any insights on completion rate / engagement rate with in-app surveys based on agencies where transit is its official app versus agencies where transit is not the official app? I would say, Marisa, this is, I think, one for you.
Yeah, I don't think that we've looked into that specifically, and we haven't done any sort of statistical tests to see if there is variation across those two groups. But I believe that anecdotally, it's been relatively consistent across different agencies.
Awesome. Sean asks, do you provide a presentation to transit teams about Rate My Ride, cost of adding Rate My Ride? I think I can take this one. We absolutely do. We would love to. Please email us at partners@transit.app. We will put that address for you in the chat.
And let me just add to that everyone in the webinar who came and the folks who that I'm not talking to because they're not here, but who registered and weren't able to show up, you'll get a follow-up email with all of this information of how to get in touch and links to the, a recording of the webinar to share with your team, as well as the RHB presentation and everything else we mentioned. If you weren't furiously taking notes, we took them for you.
All right, we've got a few more. James asks, could you talk about ways transit is not representative, maybe by age? I cannot imagine many seniors are using smartphones. David, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the age stuff that Kai showed earlier, I think is really helpful. I mean, I think what you can see and what we know from looking at the locations of users in specific places is that we do oversample young people. There does tend to be, if you look in a college town or a place around a college, I happen to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's a lot of colleges around there. If you look around the colleges, you see more people. You still see it being representative outside of those areas, but you do see larger samples there. And so we think about that as we share the results. But you can see that, we've got a large proportion of people, the age group, the second largest age group, just after the 45 to 54s, that Kai showed is 55 to 64. And they kind of trade back and forth. So while maybe, my grandmother, if she was still with us, wouldn't be using it, my mother, who's in her 70s, definitely uses the app, and it's not just because I work here, I think.
If she's at all like my grandmother, she also sends you the occasional text message complaining about how to, okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
I like this question. So Susan asks, why do you trust users who may not have a disability or experience with surveying to identify if a stop is accessible or not via Rate My Ride? Marisa.
Yeah, so I think the big thing here is that we don't necessarily trust just an individual user. to give us that answer, but we're looking at patterns. We're looking at responses from more than one person about the accessibility of the stop. The other thing is we give them the option to say that they're not sure. And the way that we phrase the question is to include temporary changes.
Awesome. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Rashid asks, why measure on-time performance this way with user-reported info? Our agency already has OTP metrics based on schedule and vehicle data. David.
Yeah. So I'll take this and then we'll say goodbye for now. So long, farewell. So what we're measuring here isn't a replacement for operational on-time performance. It measures the user experience, the lived experience of these users. Do they perceive this? So you could have an amazing on-time performance, high 90s, but because your predictions are off, or because your schedule is bad, or because there's traffic and the drivers drive slowly from whatever reason, or because of the way you measure on-time performances, when it leaves the terminus rather than along the route, you don't know what the user actually perceives. And ultimately, it's the user's perception, not your operational performance, which measures whether or not people are going to return. Essentially, this question is the same. It's, high frequency or low frequency, real-time info or no real-time info. You get that same result. You get this comparable result against all of your routes. So you can really get a sense of how the customers perceive it.
Awesome. Thank you, David. We've gotten even more questions. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to them all. Thank you all very much for coming. We're going to end here and see you next time.